how are these workers different? Well, the professional worker was characterised by technical skill and knowledge, the mass worker by collective discipline. The socialised worker is defined by communication and sociability. So we've moved, Negri argues, from a working class massified in direct production in the factory to social labour power, a new working class now extended throughout the entire span of production and reproduction. And this worker is socialised because they work everywhere. So the time of social labour power is a working day so extended as not only to comprise within itself the relation between production time and reproduction time as a single whole, but also and above all to extend the consideration of time over the entire life space of the labour market. What he's saying is that socialised workers produce value for capital anywhere and everywhere, in workplaces or plugged into the internet at home or on trams, trains, boats and planes, and in between, as you see at airport lounges and so on. So the boundaries between work and non-work have become hopelessly blurred. Socialised workers are people like ourselves, capable of listening to earnest public lectures. Intellectual work, as Negri notes, has become eminently productive. Now, this development hasn't contracted the number of working class people, as people often tell us, but in fact has expanded the meaning of working class. Negri argues that the emergence and growth of diffused forms of production has enlarged the labour market enormously and redefined as productive a whole series of functions that would otherwise not be seen as such. But how does evolution from one manifestation of class composition to another actually occur? Well, here we need to come to terms with the notion of cycles of struggle, the process of composition, then decomposition and recomposition of the working class. And why this happens is that basically every time the working class gets too uppity, capital wants to hit it on the head. So if workers resisting capital compose themselves as a collectivity, capital must strive to decompose this cohesion by revolutionising the means of production, by recurrent restructurings involving organisational changes and technological innovations that divide, de-skill or eliminate dangerous groups of workers. And that decomposition gives rise eventually in due course, and it might be decades later, to the development of new forms of struggle or a recomposition of the class. So the working class is perpetually remaking itself again and again. Negri emphasises the dynamism of the processes of recomposition. So where Marx and Engels portray dynamism as the prerogative of capital, Negri locates dynamism in the process of working class composition and recomposition. He says that capital's dynamism only results from a continuous struggle in which the thrust of the working class is accepted and new weapons are forged in order to prevent the class acting outside capital. So how have cycles of struggle manifested themselves during the past century? Well, Negri argues that the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the widespread experience of workers' councils across Europe and even in parts of North America in the period 1918 to 1926 scared the daylights out of capitalists. It persuaded them of the need to decompose that class of professional workers who had indicated their militancy. So capital reorganised production so as to reduce dependence on these workers. Complex machines replaced the simple ones so that less skilled workers could be used to replace the professional workers and look after those machines. And employers restructured and automated production. Enter the mass worker of Negri's terminology, the Fordist worker of academic discourse. But that mass worker needed to be held in check. The means for containment of the mass worker was what Negri calls the planner state, influenced by Keynesian economic policies that commenced with Roosevelt's New Deal period in the USA in the mid-1930s, before spreading globally and remaining dominant until the 1970s. Negri writes in his essay on Keynes, it was Keynes whose disenchanted diagnosis indicated for the international capitalist class the therapy to be applied. Keynes was perhaps the most penetrating theorist of capitalist reconstruction, of the new forms of the capitalist state that emerged in reaction to the revolutionary working class impact of 1917. So Keynesianism was the response by capitalism to the Bolshevik Revolution, which indicated capital could survive only by integrating the working class movement. It was triggered by the Wall Street crash of 1929, which destroyed the classic liberal myth of the separation of state and market, the end of laissez-faire. Paradoxically, Negri explains in his essay on Keynes, capital turned to Marx in order to resolve the problem of working class antagonism, at least for the moment. And Negri writes how working class political revolution could only be avoided by making the working class function within an overall mechanism that would sublimate its continuous struggle for power into a dynamic element within the system. The working class was to be controlled functionally within mechanisms of equilibrium that would be dynamically readjusted from time to time by a regulated phasing of the incomes revolution. So the problem for capital, the imperative that underpinned Keynesianism, is the autonomy of the working class. And he also says this in his essay on Keynes. So the working class is what drives the development of capital and the way it develops political solutions. So Negri relates the intricacies of Keynesian economic theory to the problem of working class antagonism. Keynes's theory recognises the working class can be neither put down nor removed, so the only option is to understand the way it moves and regulate its revolution. The theory of effective demand in Keynes assumes class struggle and sets out to resolve it on a day-to-day basis in ways that are favourable to capitalist development. But there were problems for capital born of the continuing autonomy of the working class, because at the end of all that Keynesian reformism, fear for the future still remains for capital because of the tendency of the power balance to consolidate in favour of the working class. And Negri recalls that by the 1960s, we were engaged in a class struggle to the rhythm of the Beatles. The degree of composition of the mass worker was starting to become a real headache for capital, leading to what Negri terms the crisis of the planner state, caused by the degree of working class struggle winning wage increases. And wage gains went hand in hand with advances in the social wage and the conquest of free time. So there was an upsetting of the virtuous circles of proportions on which Keynesian development depended. And in the 1970s, the crisis for capitalism became deeper. The wage variable developed its own independence, its own autonomy, a kind of economic political dual power came into existence. In other words, the working class was doing far too well at this point in time. So, Negri argues capital abandons the Keynesian Fordist form of management that had characterised the immediate post-war decades to establish positions of counterattack from which they might destroy proletarian and working class hegemony. So within production, capital responds to the international wave of struggles by the mass workers of the 60s and 70s by decentralising production. This strategy of restructuring began to break down the large factories and disperse the mass workers throughout the whole space and time of society, thereby decomposing the technical structure of their work discipline and the political organisations that express their demands, such as unions and mass reformist parties. And that restructuring from the mid-1970s was effected above all through mobility, which involved capital mobilising against labour to prevent unification by constantly exercising its capacity to repress, to fragment fragment and to introduce hierarchical division. So this is why management keep changing their vocabulary and inventing, ever newer and crazier ways of inflicting forms of measurement on us. The new proletarian subject, Negri Rights, socialised worker, is characterised by its cultural and social, spatial and temporal, horizontal and vertical mobility. On the political field, the counterattack of capital commenced with the attack on public spending from the late 1970s. From the point of view of capital, the welfare state had become too generous and sustained working class power, so public spending had to be reoriented in ways that instead undermined working class aspirations. That attack on public spending involved a break with Keynesian attempts to stimulate demand. And that action contradicted the aims of profit-making, but was consistent with the ideology of poverty and divisiveness that capital began promoting within the working class in order to counter the tendency towards solidarity on the part of socialised workers. He says a large number of poor people, besides obstructing the unitary organisation of the socialised worker, also gives rise to the vicious blackmail represented by the unconcealed manifestation of widespread misery. And he goes on about how this creates a situation where workers are desperate for any sort of wage rate, and racism and conservative religiosity all work together to rupture working class unity against capital. Negri also points to the way at this time the rise of free market new right ideology went hand in hand with increasingly authoritarian suppression of those who stood to lose from this reorientation away from Keynesianism towards neoliberalism. He talks about the counter-revolution of the capitalist entrepreneur today can only operate strictly within the context of an increase in the coercive powers of the state. The new right ideology of laissez-faire implies as its corollary the extension of new techniques of coercive and state intervention in society at large. So much for small government. So in the current period, Negri is saying decomposition has undoubtedly occurred. Neoliberal globalisation has subdued the working class. But Negri's autonomous Marxism doesn't see globalisation as an inevitable, inescapable, inexorable, ineluctable process happening to the world and occurring naturally due to the internal momentum and dynamism of capital. Globalisation is not like the weather. It's a deliberate strategy on the part of capital to prevent the working class realising its autonomy. But Labor will, in due course, recompose and present itself in ways newly problematic to capital, because every capitalist restructuring aimed at decomposing the working class has to recruit new types of labour and therefore yield the possibility of working class recomposition that involves different sorts of workers with fresh capacities of resistance. At the moment, capitalism can't avoid creating technologically capable workers, and it's very dependent on them. In fact, the ultimate dependence of capital upon labour is glaringly obvious in the case of information technology workers, whom you might see as an emergent cybertariat. We come now to the notion of empire in Negri. In 2000, the publication of this co-authored book, Empire, was taken up enthusiastically by many anti-globalisation activists. In Empire, Hart and Negri note how the primary factors of production and exchange, money, technology, people and goods, move with increasing ease across national boundaries. Hence, the nation-state has less and less power to regulate these flows and impose its authority over the economy. However, and this is the important point, the decline in sovereignty of nation-states does not mean that sovereignty itself has declined. On the contrary, Hart and Negri's basic hypothesis is that sovereignty has taken a new form composed of a series of national and supranational organisms united under a single logic of rule. This new global form of sovereignty is what they call empire, and they describe it like this. So all seems pretty hopeless, but the real substance of empire is less the overwhelming power of capital expressed through this new formation than the potential power of labour. Because Hart and Negri go on to say the passage to empire and its processes of globalisation offer new possibilities to the forces of liberation. The creative forces of the multitude that sustain empire are also capable of autonomously constructing a counter-empire, an alternative political organisation of global flows and exchanges. The struggles to contest and subvert empire, as well as those to construct a real alternative, will thus take place on the imperial terrain itself. Indeed, such new struggles have already begun to emerge. Through these struggles and many more like them, the multitude will have to invent new democratic forms and a new constituent power that will one day take us through and beyond empire. And of course, this is published just after the Battle of Seattle. Empire was taken up by anti-globalisation activists, and I think they did so because autonomous Marxism does speak more clearly to people discontented by globalisation than classical Marxism. Negri's Marxism brought us the notion of empire, but it also enables us to conceptualise counter-empire, to imagine alternatives to empire, to corporate globalisation. But why? How can they be so optimistic about the future? Well, optimism is indicated, they argue, because of the extraordinary possibility for the development of human creativity that the reappropriation of labour in the brain today permits. Now, to understand Negri's meaning here, it's necessary to go back to the characteristics of the socialised worker. So he's arguing that because of the nature of work, the nature of the worker, there is a increasingly subversive potential in the contemporary typical worker. The socialised worker of the current era is, as we've seen, the networked, communicative, sociable worker of the office. The socialised worker produces value for capital anywhere and everywhere because the factory is no longer the specific site of labouring activity and its transformation into value. Those processes are now diffused throughout society and include such infrastructures as communications networks, information systems and so on. Because of that diffusion of labour, the socialised worker is excessively productive. Value exists wherever social locations of working cooperation are to be found and wherever accumulated and hidden labour is extracted from the turgid depths of society. The highly productive socialised worker is not yet easily recognisable as proletarian because the socialised worker is in the early stages of development and has not yet become a fully composed class subject. But, Negri warns, from inside this fetishistic world, the antagonism of living work is affirming itself and resistance is building. Now, that fetishistic world is the key. The potential for composition is there precisely because of the all-consuming nature of socialised work. Because the terms of exploitation are now relocated on the social terrain, and it's no longer possible to relate exploitation to the time measure of a normal working day, then the proletarian subject, he says, is reborn in antagonistic terms around a radical alternative, an alternative of lifetime, as against the time measure of capital. And the subversive potential of the socialised worker is increased the more the labour force becomes intellectual and social and has the capacity to reappropriate control of the labour process. So as the socialised worker bucks up against capital's colonisation of his or her lifetime, These attributes of productivity and capacity to reappropriate control of the labour process heighten the antagonism of the socialised worker. When the whole of life becomes production, all lifetime becomes production time. But socialised labour power tends to unloose itself from command insofar as it proposes a life alternative, and that antagonism becomes increasingly deep and rigidly structured. So come now to the idea of the social factory. This is the way the ideas, the principles of capitalism spread themselves everywhere. And the social factory is the product of real subsumption. Real subsumption has demolished the walls of workplaces and disseminated the logic and structure of capitalist production relations throughout society. So logically, that makes all activities directly productive in capitalist terms. Now that seems highly functional for capitalism, but it also expands the opportunities for struggle against capitalism. Because as the processes engaged to valorise capital in production spill over into society, then society as a whole becomes a terrain of struggle against capital. So for Negri, the front of struggle against capital snakes through homes, schools, universities, hospitals, the media. It takes the form of confrontations, not just in the workplace, but outside of the workplace, about parenting and health benefits, about the welfare state, about childcare, opposition to ecological damage, and so on. And protection of the environment becomes an important part of anti-capitalist struggle because the social factory is also increasingly spilling over into the environment as a whole. So in Negri's analysis then, the wider society, including the natural environment, has become a terrain for struggle against capital. And the more the violence inherent in exploitation acquires an intellectual and social character, the more it bears down on people. And that ultimately invites reaction from those who experience it. So then we come to his notion of the circulation of struggles. We've already seen how the socialised worker is antagonistic because of their extraordinary productivity and capacity to reappropriate control of the labour process, and that antagonism is also polyvalent and manifold. In decomposing the mass worker and introducing the socialised worker, capitalists wanted greater mobility throughout society, but once they'd got that, they found themselves challenged by new social movements, such as the women's movement. So the period of the social factory is the political moment of the new social movements, but Negri understands all those new social movements as an aspect of struggle against capitalism, not evidence of the death or demise of class, but rather as a proliferation of it, because the new social movements, he argues, are a broad revolt by different sectors of labour against their allotted place in the social factory. And so the new movements of struggle represent a new level of class antagonism, a plural expansion of that antagonism, a circulation of struggles which cannot be reduced to mere subjectivities around life needs that have nothing to do with capital and class. In fact, the capitalist international division of labour often incorporates and depends on discrimination by gender, race or ethnicity to establish its hierarchies of control. So balkanisation of the labour market has been an important weapon for corporations in the period of globalisation. So Negri argues that the conventional division between the old class labour movement politics and new social movement politics is mistaken, that there's an increasing intersection between these struggles, and that this circulation of struggles is a blossoming of working class struggle, created by the revolt of subordinated and super-exploited sectors of labour. So Negri's Marxism affirms the otherness of labour from capital, but also the variety within labour, a plurality of agencies in a circulation of struggle. So Negri is positively enthusiastic about new social movements because they resist the real subsumption of capital. Which brings us to our final discussion of the multitude. In Empire, they introduced the concept of the multitude as the coming revolutionary subject. the way empire creates this potential for the development of the multitude. And they foretell the appearance on the world scene of the organisation of the multitude as a political subject. They offer omens such as the organisation of the multitude as political subject as posse thus begins to appear on the world scene, but then they insist they don't have any models to offer for this event. They say only the multitude, through its experimentation, will offer the models and determine when and how the possible becomes real. In some ways, Empire is a deeply annoying book. But in 2004, they produced a sequel called Multitude, War and Democracy in the Age of Empire. And that book focuses on the multitude, this living alternative that grows within empire. And they distinguish the multitude from other subjects such as the people, the masses and the working class. The people's a unitary concept, the multitude is many, composed of innumerable internal differences. The masses have different people within, but they're submerged and drowned in an indistinct conglomerate. In the multitude, by contrast, social differences remain different. The multitude is many-coloured, like Joseph's magical coat. The working class at its broadest comprises all employees, but it doesn't include unpaid domestic labourers and others who don't receive a wage, whereas the multitude is an open, inclusive concept that captures the importance of the recent shifts of the global economy. And the project of the multitude is democracy. They then elaborate on the idea of the common, and they distinguish this from the commons, the shared space of the pre-capitalist period destroyed by the advent of private property. And this idea of the common provides a key to why and how the multitude becomes a transformative subject, contributing to the possibility of democracy. They say that the common we share is not so much discovered as produced by socialised workers. Communication, collaboration and cooperation are based on the common and in turn produce the common in an expanding spiral relationship. The production of the common is central to every form of social production and is the primary characteristic of the new dominant forms of labour. And it goes on about how labour relies on the production of common knowledge. And then just last year in his 2008 book, Goodbye Mr Socialism, Radical Politics in the 21st Century, Negri states his desire to reclaim the idea of communism in this century as the common capacity to reproduce the social in freedom as the only alternative to postmodernism and the beginning of a new great cycle of civilisation. He says the multitude in its socialised labour is already characterised by autonomy, independence and cooperative capacity, which is quite different from the traditional left, which could only imagine a seizure of power, that is, putting itself in the place of the capitalists to manage economic development. And one of the political expressions of the multitude is the anti-corporate globalisation movement. And he describes the broad range of social struggles that have erupted over the past decade. Interesting reflections, although one might quibble with his musical judgment when he comments that rap is the soundtrack of the hybrid multitude. And in another recent book, he describes the multitude like this. And so finally, that idea of the multitudes rising reminds us that there is one problem that will always remain with capital: its ultimate dependence upon and therefore the power inherent in the commodity necessary for profit-making, labour. Class composition is in a state of constant flux, but because capital is a system that depends on labour, it can't completely destroy labour. So that inversion of the classical Marxian emphasis on the power of capital is at the heart of Negri's autonomous Marxism, rendering it better able than mainstream classical Marxism to countenance the capacity to contest corporate globalisation as the working class recomposes itself and asserts its autonomy. And that's it. Thank you.